All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have a chance to talk to somebody who's new to me, but whose work I've been kind of watching for a little while. His name's Eric Schlappi, and he is the brains behind Schlappi Engineering, who is the maker of some really interesting modules. Initially, I was going to say like home workshop related modules, since he has one called 100 Grit and another one called Angle Grinder. I was sure the next one was going to be something like drill press or something, but no, we have interstellar radio, so we have to throw a little space into action as well. But these are three pretty amazing little devices, and we'll get into a little bit about what they do. But first, let me shut up and say hello to Eric. Hey, Eric, how's it going?
It's going good.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I know you have got to be busy because you are practically everybody I know has got one of your modules, particularly the Angle Grinder I see everywhere. I think some of it was because Tim Held gives it a lot of coverage on his podcast, but it's a module that has got people talking.
They should talk to me more.
Uh-oh. Well, there you go. Okay, that's the shout out to everyone out there. Let's talk to Eric about stuff. So, for people who aren't familiar with your modules, why don't you give us a quick rundown of the stuff that you're doing?
So I have 3 out so far. They're all analog. The first one actually is the interstellar radio, which is never sure how far to go on technicalities, but it's sort of like a FM-based noisemaker processor. There's the Angle Grinder, which is a quadrature sine wave oscillator and wave shaper, which you can think of as sort of a complex feedback network that does filtering, oscillation, and wave shaping. And then the 100 Grit is the most recent one, which is ostensibly a distortion module, but it consists of a transistor ladder filter, a vintage styled VCA, and then a distortion, which is related to the headphone output of a certain vintage synth, and touch points, brass touch points on the front that are connected throughout the circuit, again, as sort of a complex feedback network aimed at audio rate modulation, which sounds like distortion.
Right. Well, it's interesting because in all 3 cases, kind of your description of the module has to include the phrase complex or the word complex, because it seems like, I don't know, maybe you're one of those guys that just can't be stopped at good enough. Because from what I can see is that each one of these things has kind of like these extra tweaks that take it a little bit over the top. I mean, in the case of the Angle Grinder, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, it would have been great to have a quadrature oscillator with some wave shaping, but then you have this whole grind circuitry stuff, which is a little unknowable. But I'd love to hear more about it. And you actually have built-in filtering, which typically would not be something that you would see in a sine wave oscillator, except the wave shaping can get so significant that having that filter right at hand is really pretty valuable. So explain a little bit about your thought process in taking the basics of a quadrature oscillator and turning it into kind of a monstrosity. I mean, a great one, but that.
There's a lot of experimentation in my process. There's usually some sort of original inspiration. And in the case of the Angle Grinder, the original inspiration was quadrature oscillators were interesting to me. I'd never actually played with one before I made one. No, that's not true. I had played with the nonlinear circuits one. But yeah, the exploring quadrature. And then at the same time, I was also exploring more traditional oscillators and The pulse width modulation circuitry is like a pulse width modulation, such a simple effect, or actually a pretty complex effect theoretically, like in the frequency domain, but a
Right.
very simple one to implement. And the original inspiration there was just kind of like, what would quadrature pulse width modulation sound like?
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, interesting. That's pretty cool. What in fact is the grind circuitry doing?
So it's four comparators, each normal to one of the output phases of the quadrature sine wave oscillator. So each one of these comparators is 90 degrees out of phase.
Oh, okay.
And then each one is running into a VCA to control the level. So it's compared against either the second output of the sine wave oscillator, also the bandpass output, or anything you put into the input jack. But then it's not just compared, it's subtracted from whatever signal is there. So instead of getting square waves, like if you put in a triangle wave there, you get, these little castles, real like sawtoothy or triangle wave type waveforms, but periodic based on the oscillator.
That must make for some pretty fascinating oscilloscope shots, right?
That one's really good for oscilloscope shots.
I remember when I was talking to Dan Snazel about some of his chaotic stuff. It was really clear that a lot of the stuff he did, when he saw a great oscilloscope shot, that was when he knew he was onto something, right?
It's easy to get lost in there for a long time.
Yeah, I bet so. Now let's talk about the interstellar radio. You said that was your first module?
Yep.
To what extent is that? I haven't experienced it, although it's funny because normally anything with the word radio in it, I'm like a zombie headed towards it, because I always kind of like stuff that kind of channels the old school radio sounds, especially like the sidebanding and all that stuff. Anything that can kind of channel that is always something that I'm in love with. And taking a peek at this, what it looks like is you kind of have a self-modulating FM tweak machine. Is it? Am I pretty much on track with that?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description, actually.
What was it about that kind of setup that made you say, so since this was your first module, this was obviously the thing that made you say, oh my God, I got to make modules. I got to do this thing.
Well, that one is based on a circuit that came from freelance work I was doing outside of the, or related to a circuit I was doing in the medical field. It uses these chips from the automotive industry that are they're VDF converters, oscillators basically, but it takes a analog voltage and modulates it onto a high frequency pulse train, and then I demodulate that high frequency pulse train by wrapping another one of these chips in a PLL loop, which has lots of interesting properties.
Right.
By running these at different clock rates, I was kind of originally thought I'd get something more like bit crushing. It is not like that at all, actually. It's after spending some time thinking about what's happening there, is definitely stacks and stacks of FM. The original thought was more as a processor, but and some people actually use it that way to great effect if you like broken radio sounds, but I tend to use it as a FM sound generator.
Signal generator, right? Well, it's really interesting, and I'll tell you, my listenership, there's a bunch of them that a lot of times in podcasts, if you get too technical, people just sort of like, I'm clicking out. In my podcast, I think, you start talking about like piping stuff into a PLL, and it's just like they push their glasses up, sit back in their chair and say, let's go, man. This seems like some really interesting stuff, but I also am fascinated that And I have to say, I love this. You're sort of like almost misusing industrial electronics to make artwork, right? I love the sound of that. You drop kind of a hint here that you were doing freelance work in the medical electronics field. And that sounds interesting. And also you're using parts from the automotive field. That sounds really interesting too. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is I like talking to people about how they got to where they are, how they got to be the creator that they are, in your case, the maker that you are, but also someone who has, I would say, from looking at your modules, has kind of an opinionated idea of what interesting music sounds like. So I'm curious, where are you coming from, man? Where do you get the electronics chops, and how much, what was your growth curve from the electronics side, but also from the art side? Where are you coming from? What were the things that influenced you and drew you into things like broken radio sounds and something where the best, probably the most apt name you could come up with was the angle grinder, right? What are the things that led you to that?
That's a good question. This is pretty. I think I'm a pretty consistent person. These have been my interests since I was a preteen. I think just horrible noises, and I've always wanted to build my own things that make horrible noises. I was not one of those people that was able to do that right out of the gate. I, did circuit bending as a teenager. Started making music with Fruity Loops. Played in various death metal bands, spent my 20s going to noise shows in Brooklyn, and got my electrical engineering degree to finally make things work. I've worked in two different vintage keyboard stores when I was relatively young. Like I've been obsessed with monosynths since I was, 15.
Okay.
But also, obsessed with monosynths and listening to early 90s death metal. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's part of where I come from.
That's interesting. Well, what was it that got you into synths in the first place? Did you just have an aptitude for noisy stuff, or did you hear something that caught your attention and there was no going back? What was it that snapped you into place?
When I wasn't into synthesizers.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool.
Like maybe I remember the Wipeout Excel soundtrack was a big deal. That We Have Explosive Future Sound of London. The sounds on that track are amazing.
Yeah.
But I don't really remember getting into synths. The first hardware synth I got was a CZ1000 that my uncle gave me when I was maybe 15, but I was already, I'd already spent years staring at vintagesynth.org or something. I was already obsessed by then. And then I got a Waldorf Pulse, and you don't want to know about all the synths that I have.
Had you burned through? So, and it's interesting that you kind of mentioned death metal as kind of like a touch point as well. Was it just sort of like the way that it embraced sort of like noise as music, or was there also something about that attitude that aligned with where you were at too?
I mean, probably as a teenager, the attitude aligned with mine. Over time, the attitude, I don't know. That's a complicated thing. But I really like the sounds. Old Obituary albums just sound wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And how about the electronics side of it? How did you, was it just literally from working your way through circuits that you found online?
So I tried to do that and nothing worked. So I went and got my electrical engineering degree, and I've worked briefly in the defense industry, in the medical industry, in the industrial industry. And that has let me build up the skills so that now the things I build work. And also, I think there's a lot to be said for taking influences outside of the canon of synthesizer circuits.
Right.
I still think there's a lot to be gained by going back to sort of original principles. Like if you go back to Bob Moog patents and old synth circuits certainly have more to give, but if the only thing you're looking at is old synth circuits, you're probably not going to do anything particularly new.
Right. Well, I would think that especially, if you've had some interaction with both defense and medical, I'm sure that you got a chance to see a lot of circuits in use that you just were like, if you just took that output and scaled it properly, it would make one hell of a modulator, right?
Yeah, and it gives you a different perspective on the circuits themselves, and also a lot more respect for all these self-taught synth designers doing really, really amazing things.
Sure, right, and indeed. Now, one of the things I'm curious about, a long time ago, I was talking to somebody about electrical engineering and getting electrical engineering degrees, and they say, and what they said at the time was that an electrical engineering degree that you would get now, other than sort of like the basic mathematics and the basic understanding of the electronics, would actually not be all that useful because it's a lot more oriented towards consumer devices and or cell phones or stuff like this, and a lot less oriented towards the kinds of things that you would it's almost like the synthesis technology is almost too crude for what a lot of electrical engineering teaching is about today. Is that something that you felt like was true, or do you think that that's just too simplifies the situation?
So I would agree with the second half, but not the first half. I felt like my degree was all math and physics and very little that it's a language, but it doesn't have a lot of direct applications. The thing that actually teaches you to design electronics that works is doing it for 8 hours a day. And, you get that first job and you might barely know how to make an op-amp circuit works, but like people that hire someone with a bachelor's EE degree and no experience, they basically just expect you to have common sense and work your way through the literature. And, you do it for 8 hours a day and you get there, and there are people who have done that without the degree that just started pounding on the electronics 8 hours a day, and I have a lot of respect for that too. You definitely don't need the degree, but the degree is helpful in some ways. Like there weren't many analog electronics classes offered, but there was a lot of DSP and communications theory and signal processing theory, and I took all of those and didn't use them for a long time, but I'm working my way back towards that stuff and finding it useful. I don't know that a Z transform would be as intuitive to me if I hadn't gone through the traditional EE degree.
Right. Now, what's interesting is having had that background, though, you have thus far avoided DSP in any of your modules, right? All of your stuff is all analog, correct?
This is true so far. Right now, my current development process, and I can't promise anything released anytime soon, but I'm going down a black hole of open source FPGAs.
Okay.
And will hopefully, traditionally I have not been impressed by almost any digital synth I've ever played with. It's just or even polyphonic synths. Like the good stuff is always analog monosynths, in my bizarre opinion, but reasonably informed opinion as well, I think.
Sure.
But been thinking about that a lot, and as in the EE, like you have to provide reasons for it. So I kind of feel like if I can do my digital processing at really extreme sample rates and bit depths, maybe I can do something that sounds as good as an analog monosynth does.
Right. So I was going to ask, I mean, you mentioned it almost right at the beginning and mentioning it again. The thing that for you is sort of like Valhalla is the monosynth, the analog monosynth. What is it? And I mean, it sounds, if what you're playing with in terms of digital is the idea of high sample rates and stuff, it sounds to me like it's the actual construct of the waveforms and the sound itself that you find particularly appealing.
So like some of my favorite synths, like a ARP Odyssey, or one of the earliest ones I got was a Moog Micro Moog that lets you frequency just audio rate modulate the filter with the oscillator.
Mm-hmm.
That sound, that's my favorite sound. And like I've never heard like audio rate modulation on most digital synths. Just it's not that great. And even on
so true.
Polysynths, for the most part, as they moved away from more discrete architectures towards these like all-in-one type chips,
like the Curtis chips, you mean?
Like the Curtis chips,
Yeah.
They don't sound nearly as good as those earlier monosynths do.
And do you think that's because also, I mean, one of the things is as things become more digital or more encapsulated in something like a chip, they also become in a way more uniform, and maybe that uniformity is some of what you're missing when you're listening to it.
Yeah. I know I'm probably getting into...
Well, I mean, you're getting into voodoo, but I think in a very real way, there's got to be something in that voodoo. I mean, I came up through the ranks when, my first synth I owned was an Odyssey. And it was because I had that David Friend book. And I was like, well, if I'm ever going to learn how to use a synthesizer, this book is going to teach me. And this book tells you how to use an Odyssey. So I better get an Odyssey, right? I came up through that, and I came up through the wonder of, oh my God, look, you can have this. I remember the first time I saw a real digital synth. It was a 360 Systems thing that had like chip-based samples. And it was like, oh my God, that sounds so much like a nylon string guitar. Well, it didn't sound anything actually like a nylon string guitar, but it sounded more like a nylon string guitar than I was going to make my ARP Odyssey sound, And so it was like, oh, that's so amazing, right? But despite the fact that there were these like technological gigas that were showing up and were very exciting, at the same time, there was a core set of people that never wanted to let go of, and particularly the analog monosynths. I mean, a lot of people bailed out of them, but very, very few of them ended up going to landfill. There were people that were just like, I can do something with this. I love the sound of this. I love the feel of it. And it's not, I think it's not only the sound, but it's the accessibility. Like you talk about with the, was it the Micro Moog that you were talking about? I think.
Yeah.
Micro, so there, it's not only that you can do this, this amplitude modulation thing, but it's the fact that it's accessible from right there, that actually makes it makes it so that kind of exploration is viable as well. And so I think that there is voodoo, but I'm not always sure for each individual where the voodoo lies. I actually have the feeling like if somebody would have, way back in the day, slipped me like a Casio CZ101 with the front panel of an Odyssey, I really got into the control of it, right? And I think that as long as moving those sliders would have made some kind of visceral difference in the sound, I would have been like, oh, I really love these analog mods, I think that my discernment came more from the feel of it than the sound of it. But I know that there are a lot of people that are really dedicated to the sound side of it, to the purity of the analog sound. And it sounds like that's something that's really important to you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is the type of sounds I'm interested in, which is often like audio rate modulation, both frequency and amplitude modulation. But yeah, I mean, once again, those CZ series, that phase distortion, it's really, I really wish they'd figured out a better control scheme for those
Right.
synths.
Yeah.
But that's a really, really cool form of synthesis I've been paying more attention to. And some people like Scott Yeager have done some really amazing things with.
Right. So, given that you're kind of you really have a joyful embrace of the monosynth, so for you, seeing the kind of come on of modular must have really been exciting to you, because in a way, it's sort of like a sort of like a write your own adventure story for monosynths, right? It really is kind of the way to build things up from building blocks up. That must have been a really big winner for you.
Yeah, I was really excited by it. It took me a while in my own music to stay, like, I took a couple whacks at it and made a lot of explorations in the studio I really enjoyed, but pretty much until I had a system of my own modules that I'd designed, I found it really difficult to put together a live case that I could perform with consistently.
Oh, really? That really surprises me, because you kind of mentioned that you've had an awful lot of synths over your days. It seems to me like you would not have a problem kind of wrapping your head around most of what you see in modular world.
I wasn't so much wrapping my head around it, though I feel like I did. There was a fair amount of it. I feel like when I started in modular synths, I was like, I've been playing monosynths forever. I know everything. And then you very quickly realize that you do not. Yeah, my first couple stabs at the modular synth, like I just didn't like all the design choices some people made, or one of my versions, I built this giant DIY synth made out of non-linear circuit stuff, which
okay, right.
I still have and I love, but trying to take 6U, you need 36U of that stuff, and you need it on all the time talking to spaceships. You don't you don't want to try and put together a 30-minute set that I don't.
Right, yeah.
I'm not telling anyone else what to do, but
right, I hear you.
I found it difficult to make a live system with that, and same with most of the other manufacturers' stuff. But with the things that I designed, I can put together a 6U that's kind of like two monosynth voices and some percussion that all cross-modulate each other and play like a solid set, kind of based on what I'm used to doing with monosynths, like one on lead, one on bass, but modulating each other and themselves.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just hard to build your own instrument and then learn to play it. It's nice having like an SH-101 and an Odyssey and knowing that they're always going to do what they say they're going to do.
Right, what it says on the tin, right. Well, it's interesting, though, because, I have had a very strangled existence with both DIY and design. And other than the one thing that I did that I really loved, which was the hardcore like sequencing, I wrote a sequencing tool for the hardcore. Other than that, every time I build something, I was so cognizant of the shortcuts or the stupidity of certain parts of it that I would sort of like browbeat myself into saying that it wasn't good enough, right? It encourages me that you love your design so much that that's how you put together your optimal system.
I don't understand any other reason why you would be making this stuff. Like, if you're not making it to make your optimal system, there's definitely
better ways to spend your time. That's great. Now, when you talk about putting together a little monosynth system out of your modules, what does that look like? I mean, so if I take a peek, I'm going to jump over here to your website. When I take a peek at your modules, I mean, each one of these things have kind of a curious multi-life, right? So the angle grinder does kind of have this combination of filtering and generation. The interstellar radio definitely has a lot of generation to it, and the 100 grit is, for me, is potentially a little unknowable, other than it's got those cool little brass touch buttons, which I can imagine that becomes a real part of your performance characteristic. But when you're putting together a voice with your modules, what does that voice look like, and what is the kind of interface patching that you're doing that makes it satisfying to you?
The way I currently have things set up in my rig is I have some analog oscillators I've designed. I don't know if I don't know if they'll ever be released or not, but I use them. So I have like a analog triangle core oscillator running into the for both voices, running into the angle grinder as a wave shaper.
Okay.
I find the angle grinder's ability just running into the grind section and back out. This is sort of the most basic use of the angle grinder, but you can create these really animated waveforms. Like on bass, I keep it kind of low, and it can create this like huge, like super saw pulse width modulated, distorted bass tone. On lead, I push into audio rate a lot and maybe use an envelope to modulate or to bring in the different grind sliders.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gotten some really good like chorusy strings out of it that are not,
Oh, wow.
that don't register as distorted so much, but you can get some pretty lush sounds out of it, actually. Then on my bass voice, I run into the 100 grit, and between the angle grinder and the 100 grit, I can get really obscene distorted bass tones out of it. But then also with the 100 grit, I can kind of pull the input and do noise solos with it,
Okay.
among other things.
It's really interesting to think about the kind of modulating the wave shaping and the angle grinder as being sort of like a kind of a lushing effect. You know, I think I had always thought of wave shaping and wave manipulation like that primarily as a form of distortion, right? In my head, it always seemed like it was a distortion type gimmick. And it wasn't until the first time I worked with a surge system and its triple wave shaper, which the wave shaper isn't like, it's nice. It's not overwhelming in terms of its effect, but I just remember all of a sudden when I started animating it, how it completely changed my vision of what wave shaping could actually provide for a sound. It's a really different way to think of what's going on. Rather than thinking of a static clipping or folding, all of a sudden now you get this movement that is just really difficult to give a single adjective to, right?
At NobCon, you were at the most recent NobCon, right?
I never get to go to NobCon because that's the same weekend as my wedding anniversary.
Oh.
And my wife does not have a desire to go to Schaumburg for our anniversary. So NobCon, I'm always out of luck on that.
Schaumburg is awful, but Dr. Chowning spoke at the most recent one, and
Right.
I encourage everyone to see go and check out the recording online. But during his talk, there was a lot of things to get out of that talk, but one thing I got out of it was that, and he was talking about FM, but I think it applies to musical synthesis in general, is that it's not really like what, or most of the time it's not so much what harmonics are present in the sound, but the movement of the harmonics over
right.
time that's interesting.
Right.
So like in this case with wave shaping, like there's any static waveform is boring, but once you start modulating the wave shape over time, you can get all sorts of really interesting sounds out of it that are not always clearly linked back to the shape, like the spectral, like the spectral content of something is not always clear from the shape of the waveform, but
right, yeah.
By changing the shape of the waveform over time, you can get, I don't know. That's where it's all, where all the good stuff is.
Well, and that's when all of a sudden the complexity of these things really works. It always gives me a chuckle, or not always, but when I see this, it gives me a chuckle when people will have a quote complex oscillator and they aren't modulating any of the complexity in it, right? It's sort of like, well, okay, I guess you have a static FM thing, and I guess that's complex, but you're missing out on so much of the depth of this module that you have, and I'm not sure that you know that.
Agreed.
So you say that you're able to perform with a 6U box of modules, huh? Do you have to? Well, first of all, you said that you do some stuff with. You have some percussive section. What do you use for the percussion part of it?
Yeah, I actually played a show last night in Portland, but so 6U plus I'm using the monom with the Ansible for sequencing. So
yeah.
I don't know if that's cheating a little bit, but the monom lives outside the case, and so does I use a external mixer.
Okay.
But my percussion section is just a hex inverter mutant bass drum DIY that I built like 6 years ago, running into the DPW limit, which is crucial, I think. Compress that bass drum and it sounds wonderful. And then I use the interstellar radio for all of the other percussion, just
Really?
changing, modulating it and changing the envelope of the amplitude can get it from weird things that function like hi-hats to snares and cymbals
Sure.
and noise washes and drones. And I think if you're using like big sounds, you don't need, and you're constantly modulating things. That's enough percussion. I don't.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that because I was actually I was talking to a friend who has performs with a relatively small rig, and he was like, if the sounds are right, you don't need a lot of them. You just need, and it sounds like you kind of live by that too. You get the right sound and then just maximize the use of that.
Yeah, and you get you get some giant distorted sound, and it's going to take up all your it's going to take up all the bandwidth anyway. So
right. It's all the noise, right?
It's all the noise. And also part of this setup is that I'm trying to do the sequencing with the monom, which only has 4 channels, which is something that I get frustrated with, and then I find out that I also find it really liberating too, just like not trying to use more channels than that. I do have another percussion sequencer coming soon, and we'll see if I expand my rig. But
interesting.
That's been really inspiring for me.
So in using the Ansible, which of the scenes do you use? Do you use the thing that basically is like the white whale one, the sequencing scene?
Kriya. Yep.
Oh yeah,
I
Kriya.
live in that.
Oh really? Interesting. That's funny because I have an Ansible too. I love it, but I have been a Earthsea user since the original module came out, and I actually really love the Earthsea implementation that's on the Ansible. But it's also always nice to know, well, if I want to shake things up, I can always like switch into a different program and have something else to do. It's cool. When you're working live, what do you said you have an external mixer for mixing things out. Do you use a lot of effects as well, or do you pretty much stick with the raw sound of the synth?
So I have a 4MS DLD in my case.
Okay.
And I keep that on the aux end from the mixer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my only effects. I don't.
Wow.
This is maybe one of my quirks, but reverb has to be very carefully applied. Otherwise, it just takes up space. But
right.
Delays always sound awesome on synthesizers. So yeah, I actually do a lot of. I think I use the DLD in sort of a basic way, but it very hands-on. Like I physically play the divisions and the feedback amount and the send amount quite a bit over the course of my set, and that's all I need.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it's interesting too that that is not a small module, so you're willing to give up a fair amount of real estate for that. It must be a significant part of your performance work then.
Yeah.
Well, crap, I just looked at the time and I see that our time is already racked up here. But before I let you go, I'm curious what you might have on the bench that might be coming out soon.
Well,
that you could tell me about.
I mean, I have a number of partially, like basically working analog modules, but these, I mentioned earlier, this open source FPGA toolchain, relatively modern, but that's sort of taken over my brain. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to take a break from diving into that to release any of my mostly finished analog ideas. It's hard to tell, and it's hard to commit to the what I'm going to end up releasing with the FPGA in it. But that is a whole world of entertaining possibilities.
I would imagine it's interesting because the whole FPGA thing, when that first came out, the tool chains were so expensive that unless you were like a cell phone developer, you just couldn't even afford the programming tools to be able to work with that. Is that now you say that there's a whole open source chain that's workable?
Yes. Yeah, so I've been wanting to dive into them for years, but each time I tried to use the vendor tools, they're awful.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, sometime, I guess they've been out for a couple years, but they've been getting traction maybe late last year. They don't support very many. It's this thing called iStorm. There's forgetting the name for the larger. There's a set of these tools now. iStorm just supports the Lattice Ice40, which is a relatively small FPGA, and they've got support for the ECP5 now, and they're working on some Xilinx things. But the thing is, to release these open source toolchains, they have to reverse engineer the FPGA, which is a pretty obscene task.
Pretty daunting task. Yeah. Oh my God.
Really, but I think it's really cool. It's so like my development platform for it is I'm just using a text editor and Linux and a make script. So I don't have to use any of the giant vendor things.
Right.
The thing that sucks about it is you don't have any of the vendor-specific IP. So if you want to instantiate a multiplier or something, then go read up on multiplication algorithms.
Oh my God. All right. Well, now I can see why you're not sure you're gonna. It doesn't seem like you're gonna have a way to like take time to microwave your TV dinner if that's what is that what you're having to go through? My God. Well, good luck with that. I'll check in with you in a couple of years to make sure that somebody's been feeding you along the way. But it sounds like a hell of work there. But are you going to be performing? You said you just performed like last night. Do you perform a fair amount in the neighborhood there?
I'm trying to. I'm also performing next week, in a week or two, in Tacoma as part of the Tacoma Noise Rodeo.
Oh, neat.
The Seattle modular synth community has been really, really nice to me. And that's at actually a mead, Cult, KVLT meadery, which seems a heavy metal themed mead restaurant. Right. I'm also trying to, I don't know if this is a weird thing to put out there, but next year I'm planning to go to Machina Bristronica in Bristol in the UK, and also Super Booth, which is about a month later in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know tons about booking shows or tours in Europe, but if anyone out there is listening and has any idea about keeping me out there for a month playing shows, that is something that I very much want to do.
That'd be really great. We have a really great international listenership, so I'm hoping that you'll get some great feedback. If anyone has ideas, make sure you check the show notes. We'll have ways to get in contact with Eric. And with that, my friend, I'm going to have to let you go. Thank you so much again for taking the time. Like as expected, I have a whole sheet of questions here that are going to have to wait for the next time that we talk. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right. With that, we'll say goodbye. Well, many thanks to Eric for that great talk. Man, I would love to see him play live because this little 6U system seems really pretty awesome. I'd love to check it out. If you want to check it out, make sure you go and check out Schlappi Engineering's website. You can see more about their individual modules. Also, for the Patreon subscribers, I have a little extra part of the interview where he talks about the development of the touch buttons for the 100 grit module, so you can check that out as well. I want to thank everyone for continuing to listen, to sharing the podcast with other people. It's really been great. I've gotten to know so many cool people through this, and I want to thank you all for making it possible. With that, I'm going to let you go for the week. Next week is a week off for me, so I will see you in 2 weeks for the first Sunday of January for us to have a go at our next interview. Thanks a lot, and have a good one. Bye.